Hi, I'm Benj. Welcome back to Doing Outdoors. And I thought it's been quite a while since I've showed you the progress of not only my no-dig beds, which I made earlier this year, but also how we're going on in the greenhouse, or should I say greenhouses, because I have actually put together and filled another greenhouse since we last did a video looking into the garden. But first of all, we'll look at the no-dig beds. And if you remember, I built 3 beds, all the same size, but each out of a different material. From where I'm stood now, furthest away was the sieved wood chip that I took from out of the woodland. The second bed, or the middle bed, is some compost that was bought in from a local company. I managed to get hold of a few bags, which has made this no-dig bed. And then the bed closest to me, bed 3, is shop bought bagged compost, and the results are quite amazing, really. Not what I would have expected, but I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So just looking from this angle, you can already see right at the back we've got corn plants. And starting with the wood chip, the corn plants are the longest. The bought-in compost from a local company, Mr. Logs I think it is, the sweet corn is the second largest, and then from the shop bought compost, they've not done so well at all. And then if we look at the onions in the foreground, the onions have done really well in the shop bought compost and in the wood chip. Now, there was a bit of an issue with this bed because it actually got dug over twice by a chicken. So it's not a fair comparison really, because these onion plants I had to replant twice. They really have been knocked back because these hadn't been dug out at all. And if we look at just how big some of these onions have grown, even though they were dug out twice, they're about the same size as the biggest onions in the shop bought compost. Now, all these onions were grown from seed at the beginning of the year. Another thing that highlights which of this compost is doing better is the onions that I planted. These were also from seed, but I didn't transplant these into a modular. They came straight out of the tray. Not doing so bad in the shop bought compost. Not doing too well, and a few have died in Mr. Logs compost. But then if we look at the wood chip, we have actually got bulbs of onions, and again these were all dug out and replanted. But I think on the whole, as you can see, everything within the sieved wood chip has performed so much better than the other two. We've got some broad beans down here, and they really did not like the soil in this middle bed, or the compost in this middle bed. You can see from the sieved wood chip they've done reasonably well. We've got some really filled out bean pods on there. And then if we go to the shop bought compost, they have got some pods, 1 or 2, but they haven't enjoyed it quite so much. And now I'm standing at the other end of these beds. You can really see the difference between the corn that I was mentioning. And they've all had the same amount of water. They've all got the same depth of growing media. And the only thing different is the growing medium itself. So, as an experiment, I think it's safe to say that the sieved wood chip from out of the wood is some really good stuff. And what I'll also show you in a minute is how the potatoes got on in the buckets, because I did another side-by-side comparison with the sieved wood chip growing potatoes against shop bought compost. We did have a load of lettuce in here, and apart from the slug damage, they all did pretty well. The runner beans that we've got in, I planted those just the other day because I had some left over and no room anywhere else. So the few lettuce that was still in had just started to bolt, so I removed them, fed those to the chickens. But for my first year growing on no dig, I'm quite happy with the results. In hindsight, I think I would prefer to make these beds a little wider. These, as they stand, are 700 millimeters wide by 4 meters long ish. I think really I'd like them about a metre wide. And like I said before, when I get enough material, hopefully this whole grassed area will become no dig growing beds. And now let's take a look at the greenhouses. And if you remember, this 8x10 is the first greenhouse I started with, and I started a no dig system in here last year. Now the media that I loaded this out with was what I thought well rotted horse manure. Well, it actually turned out to be not so well rotted, and the plants in here really suffered last year. But I've given it a top dressing from, well, of, again, sieved wood chip from out of the woodland and a couple of bags of shop bought compost mixed together. Now putting that on top of the horse manure from last year, the plants in here are doing absolutely fantastic. I'll turn you around and you can see the tomato plants are doing well. Loads of tomatoes on. Nothing ripening off just yet. We've got cucumbers growing up the back, again with massive cucumbers on. Some sweet chilies, some chili pepper plants down this right hand side, and we've also got some melon growing up, and we have actually got one melon that's set itself so far, and you can see that just down here. I'm really quite proud of this melon. It's not massive yet, but look at the chilies. These are the Havana Gold. Plenty of chilies. We've got some lunchbox sweet pepper. Plenty of fruit on them. And then we've got some long sweet pepper. But these tomatoes, look at the size of those. I'm just looking forward to when they start ripening up a bit. Cucumbers, we've got two different varieties here. This variety is actually Telegraph, and I harvested one off this plant just the other day. Really quite sweet for cucumber. So all in all, greenhouse number 1 is doing really well. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. And then we come into greenhouse number 2, a little bit smaller than that one, and I erected this earlier this year. And in fact, I planted out all the plants in here about 10 days after the big greenhouse got planted up. But the construction's the same. I built the base out of some metal profile just to give it an extra bit of height. It's not quite so high as the first one, but it's doing a good job. I made these growing beds with a mixture of shop bought compost and sieved wood chip from out of the woodland. We've got sweet peppers down here, and you know what, nothing's really doing extremely well in here. Now it could be a couple of reasons. First reason being that this is the first year that the no dig bed was made, and I had similar results in the big greenhouse behind me, but I thought that was solely due to the horse manure that I used to grow stuff in. But everything in here you can see is a lot lighter green than in the big greenhouse. And yes, they were planted in here 10 days later than the big greenhouse. They haven't caught up quite so well. We do still have some tomatoes on, so it's not a dead loss. We are still going to get a crop out of this greenhouse, but it's not nearly as bountiful as the greenhouse behind me. And again, we've got some melon plants here. I haven't got a melon set on these yet, but I'm very hopeful that in the next couple of days we'll be able to see something pushing on. And one thing that I'm going to show you is what I've done in both of these greenhouses, and it's the first time I've grown or trained my plants in this manner. And that's, you can see these orange strings tied to a bit of fencing wire. Now these go down and are under the root ball of each plant, or each plant that's going to grow tall and need support. And then you just wind the tomato plant or the cucumber plant or the melon plant around it as it grows, and it really is a very good support system. The metal wire is just fixed from one side to the other side of the greenhouse, and then intermittently I've got some wire hanging down which I've fixed with a greenhouse clip to give it support along its middle, and it's proving to be a very efficient system. Something that I robbed off Charles Dowding. He showed us on a video how to train your plants, or set the string at least to train your plants, and obviously I've just adapted it to suit my greenhouses. Again, fence wire, string going straight down, and these plants are doing really well. All of the tomatoes which are growing, this is a sweet cherry tomato, and this tomato just there has just started changing colour. But the amount of tomatoes that these are putting out, the variety is Sweet Appetit. And we've also got basil planted out just in front. Some of it's going to seed, and in fact this one I am letting go to seed, but the others hopefully we should still be able to harvest for a while yet. But I'm really happy with how the big greenhouse has turned out this year. Hopefully next year, once the ground has settled underneath this no dig system, and I think that's what it really took for that to be good this year, is that the ground to settle, for those important microbes to be present in the soil below. I don't know, we'll keep going. But I have actually got another greenhouse, picked that up just a couple of weeks ago. I'll get that erected over winter, and I've also got another one lined up coming from another garden. So hopefully starting for spring next year I should have 4 greenhouses, getting up to somewhere where I'd like to be with the greenhouses. Obviously indoor growing space is some of the best, and it's at a premium, so the more I can get the better it'll be. And now I'll take you around and we'll just have a look at some of the potatoes that I grew in buckets. Now I've been harvesting these over the few weeks, so there aren't many buckets left, but I've left a few just to do a side-by-side comparison for you, showing which potatoes grew best. Was it in the wood chip or was it in the shop bought compost? But I've got a bit of a complaint to make about growing in these plastic buckets, and that is that they require a tremendous amount of water. Now at the beginning of this season, between May and June, we had quite a particular hot spell, and keeping on top of watering these buckets was a bit too much really. Whereas potatoes that you put in the ground, they can send roots deeper into the ground to search out the water. When they're in a bucket, They're obviously a lot higher out the ground, they're susceptible to dry out a lot easier and quicker. So I'm in two minds whether I'm going to grow potatoes in buckets again. I think the first earlies that I set and started in the greenhouse, that was a good idea because it enabled me to get a really early crop of potatoes, and they did reasonably well. But let's get into it. Let's have a look and see which performed best out of these potato buckets. Right, so here we have the two pots. In this pot, this is the shop bought compost. You should be able to tell by looking just at that. And this pot is the sieved wood chip. And one thing I said about this variety of potato, which is Rocket, is that when I've grown these in the ground previously, they give you quite a long season. You can harvest them early for quite a small new potatoes, or leave them in the ground and get potatoes almost as big as your fist, which are also good for mashing, I find. But because I had such trouble keeping these moist, they died off pretty soon, so the potatoes aren't massive. But let's have a look. Sieved wood chip first. And you really can see, especially with this wood chip, how dry it is just under the surface. And the potatoes are only just very small. Well, there we have it. That's the harvest from the wood chip. And there's a lot of potatoes there, they just haven't grown to a very good size. Now I put that down to me not being able to keep them wet enough. Now let's go and have a look through the shop bought compost. And one thing you can notice straight away from this shop bought compost is how much water it's got in it. You can squeeze it out. It has been raining a lot here, but compare that to the wood chip, that was very, very dry. The potatoes are bigger. Let's get a tray. Well, there we have the harvest from the shop bought compost. Now if you compare that to the wood chip, I think we can agree that there's far more potatoes growing in the wood chip than there are the shop bought compost. However, we have got bigger potatoes in the shop bought compost. So just looking at it as they are now in the trays, I do think there's more potatoes that have grown in the wood chip than what grew in the shop bought compost. But I'll get these weighed and I'll put the weights up on the screen now. And obviously, going by the weight, that can only be the real tell. But I do believe that if I'd kept more water on this wood chip, these would have got bigger, and because there's more of them, it would have done a better job. But ultimately, the wood chip came out of the woodland. It hasn't cost me anything. There's 30 litres of this shop bought compost gone into here, so when you're looking at a 40 litre bag costing you £5 or £6, this is looking like the better option all round. And well, there is just one more item I want to touch on whilst we're talking about growing, and that is my compost making. I am still actively making compost, although not as furiously as I was at the beginning of the year, and that's mainly because there's so many more jobs that are taking my attention. But I have managed to fill 3 bays so far since April, which is when I started. And the compost which I made back in October with a lot of the leaves and grass clippings, I turned into here, and I am actually growing some courgette and pumpkin plants, and as you can see, they are thriving within this compost. There's one of the courgettes that is quite long overdue picking. I shall take that in a minute actually. And I've been picking courgettes from this plant for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and we are starting to see some pumpkins starting to form. But what I really want to do in the next coming weeks is build some more bays, because these 2 in particular I'd like to get them turned into another bay because the heat has gone out of the compost. They are running actually at 30 degrees now, but if I flipped them, reinvigorated it, maybe added some more moisture if they need it, will kickstart that breaking down of the material again, because I need an absolute ton of compost ready for when I build more no dig beds, hopefully later this season, come the winter, because I want to be growing loads more veg than I already have done this year. And this year I've grown more than I have done any other year because I was only growing in my back garden, and we have now got these no dig beds to take a harvest from. Although they're not performing exactly how I want them, they are still a success. One thing that I will tell people is that if you're going to set up no dig beds, when I built these, the ground was really wet, so the cardboard that I put down deteriorated quite rapidly, and especially where the wood chip is, I've had quite a lot of weeds push through, mainly the dock leaves. The other two bays have been quite maintenance free, but for some reason the cardboard broke down rapidly under that wood chip, and I've had quite an issue with getting the weeds out. So if I was going to do it again, I would probably put a double layer of cardboard down if the ground was as wet as it was when I built these. Well, that's all I've got time for on this video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.